Greetings. I am Assumpta Uturu, Spotlight Africa, KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles, and streaming live on kpfk.org. On Wednesday, September 11th, I had the honor and privilege of speaking with Matt Ehret, who is the director of the Rising Tide Foundation based in Montreal, Canada. Matt Ehret is a geopolitical analyst. Our conversation took place a few days after the two-day Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit concluded on Friday, September 6th in Beijing, China. I also spoke with Matt Ehret a day after the first U.S. presidential debate between the presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. In discussing the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, the American presidential debate, and 9/11 23rd anniversary, Matt Ehret links those topics from a historical and contemporary perspectives. So to begin, what is your assessment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation? I know a year ago in December, African leaders left Washington with a promise of 50 million. They left China last week also with a promise of 50 million. So when you look at the two offers and the implementation and the effectiveness and how Africans are going to utilize this money, how do you sort of contrast or compare the two offers, if I can put it that way?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And I think it really gets at the heart of the paradigm, the opposing paradigms that are clashing for dominance over the new emerging economic architecture, as well as security architecture, which is going to be brought online as the current system that was largely, I guess you could say, sparked in its current form in 1971, especially over the dead bodies of people like President John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King. There was a takeover of the U.S. establishment, the U.S. system, which had many problems previously, but it really got taken over at that moment. And a new policy doctrine was introduced under the form of the trilateral commissions, management of the U.S. economy, especially under people like Nixon, who didn't understand what was going on half the time, especially Carter, who was a deeper fool, who really didn't understand what was going on, Ford, where people like David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and many, many other representatives of the system of Anglo-American imperialism became the dominant forces shaping U.S. policy, both in terms of its domestic priorities, what its energy was going to be, what its idea of consumerism was going to become, deregulation of the corporate and banking sector was going to become, and foreign policy is in terms of the creation of the petrodollar, the creation of the idea of a hegemon that would base itself in its self-interest upon expanding its reach and its power to influence smaller nations around the world as a unilateral, unipolar hegemon imposing the will from above. That really was a big turning point in 1971. And since then, the creation of this monstrosity of Anglo-American imperialism, the U.S. empire as it's come to be known, has really created a parallel that can only be seen, I believe, in a serious way as in a similar fashion to the end phases of Rome's fall from republicanism into empire, and from empire into total disarray and collapse under its own immoral expansionist ideology that demanded ever more impoverished slave people to satisfy a gluttonous, hedonistic capital of people who would simply be managed by wine and bread and circuses forever. So that's not durable. And I think the US is sort of in that late stage imperial collapse mode. And so when you see similar things like what, as you mentioned, was a $50 million offer from the West to African states versus the same identically nominal in terms of monetary terms, $50 million propositions from China, from coming out of the recent China Africa summit, there is a different paradigm associated with how are those monies going to be operating, and will they actually benefit the people living in the continent of Africa and their neighbors externally. And with the United States, I believe what you've seen are more of the same conditionalities that have done so much damage associated with loans from the World Bank or US aid or the IMF for the past 60, 70 years, really, which are designed to prevent Africa from actually benefiting from the bountiful resources, the agricultural soil, which is so amazing in Sudan and Congo and the Sahel region. There's nothing involved with actually empowering those nations of Africa to benefit themselves, the people, in any serious way. Versus when I look at the type of characteristics associated with the Chinese business practices with Africa, I see something very different. And whether it's the building of durable infrastructure, hard and soft, schools, hospitals, as far as soft, but also hard in the form of rail lines that we've seen built up with the guidance of Chinese engineers in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, but also now in Tanzania, where there's upgraded and extended lines from the Tanzanian railways that were built up originally in the 1970s as the Freedom Rails. That's being also expanded with an idea, an orientation towards really, I believe, benefiting the nation's peoples by giving them high quality educational experiences in China. In some cases, China's trained tens of thousands of engineers and technicians to become the best quality, high level operators of the infrastructure built up within Africa, so that they could do it themselves and really just learn what they should have had the right to know, but that has been kept from Africa for decades and generations. And China's got a different philosophy with the idea that if you don't kill your neighbors and keep them impoverished, they will be better business for you. They'll be more inclined to respect you if you've assisted them in getting out of squalor and standing on their own 2 feet. So yeah, no, I've seen a lot of very positive priorities placed with the Chinese $50 million pledges and the already existent vast array of infrastructure that's tied to the Africa Agenda 2063 initiatives to extend rail lines beautifully east, west, north, south, all across Africa to build a real Pan-African renaissance. Those are real ambitions that I think are really good and which imperialists despise. So yeah, very, very different views of East and West that we see coming at Africa right now.
It was interesting, Matt, yesterday watching the debate between the presidential candidates here in the United States and suddenly realizing that there is that acknowledgement of the demise of the empire. But then none of the candidates sort of presented a kind of a concrete answer to what is happening to whether, I don't know whether the word restores is being referred to as making America great again, because how do you sort of rebuild from the ashes when you don't even recognize that there are ashes to pull from?
Yeah, I know. Well, it's part of it's difficult. I watched this debate, most of this debate as well the other night. And I don't know when our show will be broadcast, but for people listening, they should know that we're talking right now on September the 11th, the day after the debate between Harris and Trump. And it was disappointing in many ways, obviously. Neither candidate challenged the national myth. You've got these sacred myths of America, the exceptional nation, Iran or China as the enemies of America. None of these sacred cows were in any way challenged. And I was hoping for a little bit more out of Trump as far as saying something that would deal with some of these things, especially considering that, now we have 9/11's anniversary happening today, which is another big national myth that has brainwashed many Americans into a paradigm that has made them support policies which are destructive to humanity, but also to Americans. Since 9/11, we were told that now the only solution to what happened on that day over 23 years ago was to bomb forever Muslim countries, starting with Afghanistan, but spreading to Iraq and Libya and Syria, to deal with international terrorism that just hates our freedoms. And, we even called French fries freedom fries for a couple of years, which was insane. And it made the world recognize the ridiculousness of America even more. Freedom fries, ridiculous. Anyway, the fact
Out
is,
of all the French cuisine, Americans chose the fries.
of course they did, right? Is there anything else? No, it's absurd. So, we're at a place now where many people that I talk to are aware that they were lied to about the official narrative of what happened on 9/11 over 20 years ago. And despite that, are still controlled by the felt manipulative emotion that they went through as sort of a hypnotic induction to convince them that the world wants to destroy America for its freedoms, and we should somehow still give our support to forever wars, whether it's in Venezuela or whether it's in against Iran, which many of those intelligence agencies that oversaw the actual event of 9/11 are actually promoting the U.S. population support the idea that no, Iran is the bad guy behind everything, and instead of killing Saddam Hussein, we should have destroyed Iran. And good people are believing this. Or China is another one I'm hearing a lot of. Like, China wants to destroy America, and so it's good that we perhaps actually try to destroy China first. Democrats tend to support a little bit more the narratives that accommodate the notion that Russia, authoritarian Russia, is actually out to destroy us, so we should destroy them first. Whereas Republicans tend to support more the narratives of China or Iran. But the point is, we're being played by the same interests that actually murdered John F. Kennedy, that carried out the fake false flag of the Gulf of Tonkin, which justified the American invasion into Vietnam in the early 1960s. It's the same FBI, CIA run, and also I would say MI6 run operation that has penetrated so many fifth columns within various governments of the world that have justified the U.S. transforming itself from an anti-imperial sovereign nation state republic into a Anglo-American hegemon. And while they killed Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy earlier, and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Fred Hampton, this whole COINTELPRO MI6 thing that has penetrated the U.S., that put the CIA online, which did things like Iran-Contra, right, supporting the growth of this narco-terrorist apparatus inside of South American countries through the hub of Panama, where Green Berets that had specialized and honed their skill at subverting nations in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos were then put their skills to work in building up an intelligence hub in Latin America through Central America, and especially Panama. Built up this whole money laundering, regime change coordinating complex, which still is there to this very day. It didn't go away. It never went away. And they're trying to do it all over again, except now, especially after Desert Storm, after 9/11, they're trying to amplify this thing in a new fashion against the interests of nations like China, Russia, the broader BRICS plus nations, who are trying to create a alternative financial architecture and security architecture that can survive the coming storm, or the storm that is already happening. And it's a very, very dangerous time, because those who have put so many generations of effort into building up this idea of a new world order, of a unelected and elite that would manage nations from above under a controlled disintegration of the Western economy, that they themselves built in the collapse function back in the 70s when they transformed the economy into a speculative time bomb of consumerism. That was designed to collapse. Globalization was never designed to be the forever model. It was always that neoliberal, globalized, deregulated order was always designed to get exactly the effects that we have seen over the past 50 years, which is the castration of sovereign nation states that could once stand on their own two feet, and the replacement of the power, the actual power, from nations to a private corporate financier interest that wants to restore a global empire above nation states. and they're willing to even blow up the world. I'm afraid that their ideology is willing to take them to a level of extreme threat to Russia, China, Iran, and other nations resistant to their ideology, to the point that they actually are going to play out a potential first strike against those countries, maybe with the veneer of some other inside job like 9/11 that might be created to convince us that either Russia or China or Iran or some other enemy of the United States from the axis of evil, the new axis of evil, has wished to undermine us, justifying any type of attack using perhaps nuclear weapons against those nations. So it's a very big concern I have.
But before we continue, Matt Ehret, can you clarify what you mean by is it the sixth column?
No, oh, no, I refer to it as the fifth column, and I
Oh, okay.
simply mean the branch of various governments that are controlled and directed by a foreign agency that is antagonistic to the well-being of the people in the nation that said branch of government is actually influenced by. So in the case when I say of let's say the fifth columnists of the United States, I'm referring, of course, to the foreign directed influence of those agencies that were built up over many, many decades after the American Revolution by the City of London, which seeded certain operations within the early American nation in the form of Wall Street, the Bank of Manhattan being one of the earliest banks seeded by Aaron Burr in the late 1790s, out of which was spawned various other banks. JP Morgan was a bank that came out of a British bank that was seated in America in the early 1850s. And the idea of an Eastern establishment elite grouping within America that would become sort of a junior partner to the British Empire in the form of a hereditary aristocracy. The Cabots, the Lowells, the Lodges. There's a certain, like, the Russell family that created Skull and Bones. You've got a limited array of these. In the 1800s, they were known as the Boston Brahmin. The Brahmin being a term that was used in India to describe the upper caste of the elites of India that would be servants of the British Empire to manage the 400 or 500 million Indian people living within India under British rule. So the British didn't have to have very many troops in India to keep the control of their crown colony for 2 centuries, because they had corrupted the elite class that had already been there before Britain entered and made them become controllers. We saw the same thing with the house slaves of the Confederate, slave power South. That would be the slaves that would carry out the whippings, but that would be rewarded for keeping the other black slaves from Africa under control. So it's been a practice used by empire around the world for a very long time. And in America, the house slaves are many of these families that wish to remain, that got their rewards by their riches, their mansions, by working with the British East India Company, in the Opium Wars, making a fortune off of destroying China's soul, their people in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. They set up these institutions which were antagonistic to the ideals of the American founding documents, which are beautiful documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And those documents are based on a rejection that moral or legal authority can come from any hereditary power structure, because America was based on a concept as an ideal that all men and women are created equal as a concept. And it was flawed in its execution by a large part. It was very hypocritical because so few people actually walked the walk. But the ideals were sound. And that rejection of hereditary institutions as the basis upon which law would be formed was preeminent, I believe, in what made America viable and good, especially when those good American presidents, who often died and were assassinated while in office, were active applying the policy against the interests of the Eastern Boston, New York establishment families that had deep penetrations. Also, you had Virginia, Louisiana families. Some of them were French from the French Empire. All of them organized the occult upsurge in the Freemasonic reorganization of the 19th century that, turned things like the Scottish Rite, both in the northern and southern branch of Freemasonry, into the only dominant choices of Freemasonic lodges available for people to join. That has been, I think, a real, very vicious, evil transformation of America into becoming this more imperially minded thing. And we saw this even really get off the ground with the presidency of Andrew Jackson, I believe the first time, where Jackson let go first of those traditions of respecting the weak, of trying not to be an empire, when it began to expand the slave power and carried out his Trail of Tears, destroying many of the lives of the Cherokee, and put them into little, approved concentration camps without fences, and moved them out of the territories that were later given to the slave power to grow cotton in the South. And the whole like national reservation system was created largely under Andrew Jackson, and then it became worse and worse with followers of Jackson's philosophy in the form of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, who also amplified the KKK a century after, or 80 years after slavery was abolished. The KKK was at its most powerful scale because of the support it was given by the FBI, run by racists like Freemasonic 33rd degree racists like Hoover and Truman as well, who was another racist who wished to empower the democratic slave power in the 1940s, 50s. And this is what people like Martin Luther King were trying to fight against, was they were trying to revive the principles of Franklin Roosevelt, of Abraham Lincoln, of McKinley, who were all people who were murdered by this deep state fifth column complex that was never American. It was always managed by a foreign agency. And that agency, as I've pointed out in my many books that I've written, is actually has a directing influence from the city of London and the old occult financier centers that are still even today rooted in Venice and certain areas of Italy, but especially England. There's branches in France that oversaw the murder of people, or the attempted murders of Charles de Gaulle, or the murder of President Sadi Carnot of France. So there are these penetrations in various countries of the world by this parasite that's been latched on for many generations.
It never stops to amaze me.
Yeah, me too.
So as this seeming new world order is emerging, my question is, I guess maybe I'm being fair to ask you, but you have that passion for the injustice that have been done particularly to the people of the global South. And that, of course, includes Africa. So my question is then, African countries prepared, especially when 50 leaders go to China, or 49 of them come to Washington, are they really prepared? And in particular, going back to China, China within a very short decade has been able to pull most of the Chinese out of poverty. Are Africans learning from this Chinese experience, even though the governments are so corrupt, that they could actually have an example through which they can also pull their people out of poverty using the Chinese example? And if China, Matt Ehret, is already even willing to share technology with Africa, although some people dispute that. And I think the chorus that we are hearing from the West is that as you go to China, you are actually being led into a slaughterhouse of debt, a slaughterhouse of producing quantity rather than quality of products. So don't even think twice about it. So I guess my question is then, are Africans prepared for this change, that they can exploit it to the benefit of their own people, although corruption is prevalent in the continent and the thinking is somewhere else, not really for the benefit of the people. So even though they go to China, one wonders whether they are serious about their own people or about themselves as leaders.
No, always good questions you ask, and I don't want to try to make China seem like they are angels, superhuman angels. I don't want to make that I don't want that to be the impression that I give people. And there are things that are worth criticizing in terms of, China is looking for often good deals. Their businesses are looking for good deals, and sometimes they will even do things that are not awesome to get good deals. But it's still infinitely superior, and I believe tied to a much healthier overarching national paradigm and orientation that China is animated by than anything I have seen in the last 50 years, especially coming out of the West, which is a general orientation towards an idea that you are better served if you don't destroy the lives of those whom you are doing business with, which I believe many Westerners have become very cynical and jaded because we've lived under this hypocritical system that professes great virtue and virtue signaling around globalization and spreading freedom, but in reality, having none of the substance and the very opposite intentions behind its governance, which anybody can discover. Anybody who's looked at the murder of JFK, the reasons for 9/11, the reasons for Vietnam, they could see very clearly that we have a very hypocritical, evil thing, which again, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, I believe, especially amongst the baby boomer generation who lived through so much of this, the assassinations of their great leaders, their heroes. And the mistake is often made to then say, well, the wise man or woman knows that all human beings are beasts against others, like we can only map out the evil and the hypocrisy, but we cannot allow ourselves to ever be so naive as to believe that the good or the noble or the true could ever exist in the realm of politics ever again, or else if we allow ourselves to believe such things, we will allow our other Vietnams to happen or whatever. I would say, well, even though said cynical realism has become so predominant amongst the West, it didn't stop our world from becoming more corrupt, more imperial, more 9/11s from happening. So it's actually not the case. And I think that we just haven't lived through authenticity for such a long time that when we see nations like China, which operate on a philosophy, like they have a deep connection to their deep 5,000-year-old, if not longer, traditions of meritocracy. Confucianism is very strong. It's actually going through a renaissance amongst the youth, especially, and you can see that by looking at many of the Chinese movies and Chinese shows and music. You'll find Westerners will be surprised if they allow themselves to actually listen to Chinese shows and entertainment that's promoted culturally, that there are almost always moral values, moral lessons, even in their music, in many of their musics, that are contained within those things that young people are seeing as popular now, and that it's being done by an intention. There's a design to bring about a certain ethical rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and it's not flimsy, flaky, wishful thinking, because they have the proof of having pulled almost 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 20 plus years. The Chinese people went from the year 2000 of only having 3% of their population living in middle income brackets to now today having over 53% living in middle income. The purchasing power of the Chinese yen has increased every year because of the qualitative growth and the large scale investments that people can see directly with their eyes. They could feel with the decreased stress of life. There's an increased ability to have greater mobility, especially for young people who do work and who express excellence. There's a much greater mobility for them to become managers, to take part in the direction of their society, and that participatory top down to bottom up relationship is so present in the lives of people living in China that I think it gives a firm foundation to the high ideals of win-win cooperation. The idea of when you hear Xi Jinping talking in his speeches, he's often speaking of a world of self where everybody has transcended Hobbesianism, the idea of might makes right, towards a world where right makes might. And it's easy to be cynical, but if you see the effects of such benefit working for everybody, and then you see China going in with no military bases outside of China except two, one in Ethiopia, they were invited by the Ethiopian government, and one I forget where, I think it's in the Middle East. But
not Djibouti?
I thought there was one in Addis Ababa too. No, am I wrong?
I don't think so. I think it's in
Okay, it's Djibouti.
Djibouti.
That's
Yes.
Djibouti. Okay, there you go. But
Djibouti
I
is
mean,
Djibouti is the home of bases.
right, eh?
It has the
Well,
French, the Americans, and the Chinese. So they
yeah,
welcome everybody.
exactly. And it's so strategic in the mouth of the Red Sea. But I mean, I think the thing I was thinking about was that the Ethiopians have a military arrangement with China to defend Belt and Road infrastructure in Ethiopia, like the Djibouti Addis Ababa rail line that's going to extend across West Africa, across Africa into the Atlantic. And that's what ISIS is targeting. So whenever you have terrorists, or in the case of Ethiopia, in different cases, the Tigray People's Liberation Front had attacked infrastructure, and often with Chinese engineers being targeted. You see the same thing in Mali, and the same thing in Central Africa. These Western proxies, who are funded by the CIA, provided arms, logistical weapons, just like they were in the case of Syria or Libya. It's the same thing for Africa. They don't end up targeting. They end up targeting nations that are resistant to U.S. hegemony. So it's clear that these are instruments. They're not really representing Islam or anything like that. They're not representing national liberation interests. They're only targeting the rivals of the U.S. hegemonists. So, again, China has a different military philosophy where their security doctrine is not based on expanding military presence around the world. They only have these two bases. The U.S. has like 800 or more U.S. military bases. They're trying to build up infrastructure that's vital to the people. They're helping support the growth and sovereignty of nations that do business with them. And it gives me confidence that they're authentic in their intentions. And it's actually it's better business. They're going to make more money. They're going to be creating more stable, reliable business networks for the companies in China to work with their allies. It's not utopian. Like, people accuse me of being a utopian romanticist, and it's like, no, I'm a realist. I just think it's more realistic to be respectful and helpful to your weaker neighbors to help them get strong than to keep them underwater. And I think that history has proven that philosophy is actually correct, and the one we live under here in the transatlantic is actually a perversity of natural law and common sense. And it's actually ultimately in the worst interest of those who are trying to manage this one world government, which is going to blow up in their face, because the world hates Washington. It hates London. It has no respect or faith in the honesty of the brokers of those powerful countries of the West. And that's not in the interest of the people living in the West.
So then, seeing what China has done in a very short span of decades, Matt Ehret, from your assessment of the outcome, particularly the Beijing Declaration, because it was interesting to read it, where it says, this is what China will do, this is what Africa will do, this is what we will do, which I found very interesting, because in most of declaration, they are always one-sided, but this one, it had three parts: what China does, Africa does, and what we'll do collectively, which I thought was very interesting, despite the 10 points that Xi Jinping outlined. I think the criticism for Africa is that they didn't seem to present what they wanted out of the meeting, and only implied reference to Agenda 63, and even Xi Jinping did the same. So I guess I'm going back to the same question as to how does Africa, do you see from the outcome of this meeting, or even watching the trends on the continent and what China is doing aside from infrastructure and so forth, that Africans are waking up to the point where they say, oh, look, this country succeeded in uplifting their people out of poverty. Maybe we could follow the same trajectory, although, you know, we are being hit hard by IMF and the World Bank that you can't do that. You know?
Yeah, no, it's quite it's quite something, and it pains me because as a historian, and I've looked at the role of the World Bank and the IMF in 1946, 1945. Originally, they were designed to be instruments for expanding, and I believe that the intention was authentic, to expand the success of the American New Deal, that was so successful in creating jobs and transforming the economy in the 1930s after the Great Depression, and expand that internationally to help nations stand on their own 2 feet, develop full spectrum agro-industrial economies with access to the best technology available that would influence and upgrade the educational systems of every nation that had suffered under colonialism. That was, I believe, honestly, the intention. And unfortunately, those imperialists within America, and especially within Great Britain, that despised the vision of people like Vice President Henry Wallace and Harry Dexter White, the first president of the or chairman of the IMF, who was a very close ally of Franklin Roosevelt and a deep anti-imperialist unto his own right. These imperial creatures took over control of these Bretton Woods institutions and turned them into tools of neocolonialism. And it's been so normalized over the past 50 years, especially, that people don't know how to think in another way. But then you look at China, like you said, and China in the 1961-62 period had an average life expectancy of about 44 years of age only. Very poor life expectancy. And today, it's more than the United States. It's at 78.33 years of age on average for the average Chinese, whereas the average American has fallen from about 77.9 years of age down to 76.6 years of age in the last 4 years alone. So, and the US lost 2 years since COVID of average life expectancy. China, we have seen a different philosophy express itself provably in measurable outcomes in terms of not just life expectancy, but also how many people at a higher quality of life could be sustained. The approach to applying technology to alleviate human labor, not to necessarily make humans redundant, but to liberate human beings to be able to use their creative labor, their mental labor, more than their physical labor, is something that we see much more in China than we do in the West. Because there is an idea of growth, an idea of having a vision to replace other previous visions that were completed, whether the Three Gorges Dam. China has built up over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in the past 19 years, most of that in the past 7 years. And they have plans on doubling that. So they're not resting satisfied saying, okay, like the West has done in the 1970s, they're not saying, okay, we're finished developing now. We're going to just become a post-growth consumer post-industrial economy that winds down into stasis. They have not made that same mistake that we had made back in the early 1970s, where that was forced onto us. And the consequences were very foreseeable, that if we stop trying to go beyond what we have by making new discoveries, translating new discoveries into new technologies, which was the norm, the ethical norm for Western civilization for centuries before this. If we stop, then the consequence would be, well, okay, that means that things will get tight. We will start fighting over limited resources, which will increasingly become monopolized by corporations that might be, let's say, tied to the Bilderberger group, which doesn't care about even money so much as they care about using money to induce nations to destroy themselves and expand the interests of a private financier oligarchy that might use corporate power the way the British Empire used the British East India Company or the British South Africa Company, but not for really doing business, but rather just for expanding power and depriving people who are in victim nations of the ability to stand on their own 2 feet by cutting off their legs under the veneer of capitalism. But it was never capitalism. It never created capital. It always destroyed capital. And that's what I think the Bilderberger groups were designed to be in the 1950s under Prince Bernhard, a former Nazi SS elite, member of the aristocracy who worked with Prince Philip, the father of King Charles, to bring online. This is what seeded the Davos form of the World Economic Forum in 1971 when it was created by a student of Henry Kissinger named Klaus Schwab. And this is it's not capitalism. It's maybe you could it's not even socialism, it's something else. It's what you might call perhaps oligarchical collectivism, that where they will utilize capitalism and they will utilize socialistic mechanisms to capture and destroy the people that they want to destroy, whether it's through what we see with Keir Starmer in the UK, who's a Fabian Society socialist. He's a member of the Fabian Society, as are many of the members of the UK Parliament that have just recently come to power. They're Fabians. They're part of this tradition, this oligarchical idea of the original Fabians of Lord Maynard Keynes, who took over the Bretton Woods complex on behalf of his controllers in the city of London in the 1940s, who was a eugenicist, who promoted the idea of racial the sterilization of the unfit and the control of global populations to acceptable standards to the mathematical wishes of an oligarchy that he believed himself to be a part of. Bertrand Russell was another Fabian, as was H.G. Wells and many others, including George Bernard Shaw and Beatrice Webb. If you read the writings of any of these people, they hated humanity. They detested the poor. They considered the poor to be the great unwashed. They believed that the world should be ruled by a master class who would control the science of eugenics. But at the same time, they appealed to the poor by calling themselves socialists who cared about labor. But in reality, they only wanted to weaponize the poor, to make the mob of the poor become their weapons and instruments of overthrowing governments that they don't like, or demanding that they receive handouts from the government at the expense of actual overthrowing of imperial structures, which is what the Fabians were so good at advancing. And they worked very closely with neoconservative little monsters who were built up, especially over the Cold War. So this is what took over control of the Western economy over, again, the dead body of Bobby Kennedy. We saw it come in a big way during Clinton's administration, which saw the infusion of Fabians and Rhodes Scholars. They always worked closely together, who took over the White House in the 90s. And they created twofold controlled opposition with the neoconservatives, followers of Zbigniew Brzezinski, on the other hand, who largely began gaining huge influence under Carter under the Trilateral Commission in the 1970s. The neoconservatives of like people like Paul Nitz, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, that came in with Carter and Ford, they really came in to be the oppositional force to the Rhodes Scholar Tony Blair neo-imperialists or liberal imperialists of the 90s. And both sides were wrong. They both were ultimately a controlled opposition, where one simply saw the US as a conduit to get to a UN-led world government, with Clinton overseeing the expansion of NATO, with the bombing of Serbia, the destruction of regulatory policies like Glass-Steagall, which Clinton destroyed in one of his last acts in office. But he had a more gradualist, he and those like Strobe Talbot and Robert Reich and other Rhodes Scholars, they had a more gradualist idea of getting at world government, getting rid of nation states in a gradual way, whereas the neocons had a more abrasive, we want the US to be at the control center of this one world government, not the UN. And so they fought each other, but it was always a fraud, this left-right dualism. And I think we see these imperial leftists and these imperial rightists who corrupted both the Republican Party of Lincoln and the Democratic Party of Kennedy. They infiltrated and corrupted both parties, and we see them now aligning in the form of their common support for Kamala Harris, where you have Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and John Bolton and the worst neocons who oversaw 9/11, the Iraq War. They're now backing Kamala Harris, and we see the more traditional pro-labor, anti-imperial Democrats that rallied around people like Tulsi Gabbard or Robert F. Kennedy for all of their problems. And don't get me wrong, I have a lot of critiques for Tulsi and Robert Kennedy Jr. However, they are representing a traditional Democratic influence, as Trump is representing a more traditional anti-imperial Republican influence that goes back to McKinley and Lincoln of protectionism, not trying to expand into forever wars, which they're converging into on the other side. So that's where the battle that I currently see forming is the convergence of these neocon, neoliberal imperialists converging together as the uniparty, and then another convergence of the better traditional American impulses from both parties on the other side. And you could see where my heart is resonating a little bit more to the idea that hopefully America can find its salvation, and by not just discovering its lost heritage that was once anti-imperial, but then looking at Russia and China from this new lens of seeing them as the representatives of that historic tradition of anti-imperialism, and looking to helping nations, whether Africa or other nations that have been abused, to stand on their own 2 feet. So yeah, that's where I'm seeing the world right now. So I hope Americans can. I'm a Canadian.
So you're allowed to criticize.
I'm allowed to criticize a bit more, I guess. But Canada's got its own huge problems too. We got some thorns in our eyes too. So I hope we can get those out as well.
Yeah, one day we'll talk about Canada's role in Africa too.
Sure. Yeah, that's a big conversation. Barrick Gold is bad.
I guess maybe until one of those internal infight which force triumphs, so what emerges out of it, because for us coming from the global south, you just look and see now the presidential elections, when a new president emerges come January, you wonder who are they going to target? Which president? Because what is it, Matt? Reagan went after small Grenada and assassinated Bishop. George Bush Sr. went after Noriega and even humiliated him by and telling the world how powerful America is by arresting a sitting president. Bush Senior Jr. went after Saddam, and then Obama, whom we all cheered as the first African American president, becomes also the first African American president to assassinate an African president of Gaddafi. So now we just sit on the fence and wondering who next, and hopefully the Democrats will be merciful if they win. That although we know Clinton allowed the genocide in Rwanda to happen so that the U.S. would continue its action in the Congo and in Central Africa, but if they regain the seat again, we'll wonder who Harris will go after on the continent, or will she wonder whether she will follow the Obama directive, or maybe she will just follow Bush. Maybe, as she said in the debate, to probably be the Iranians. Who knows?
Yeah, I know it's disturbing. Personally, I found the debates to be very disappointing, and I think Kamala gave Trump a lot of very easy things to destroy in her absurd remarks, and he just completely failed to raise the conversation to a level of policy, since it is known that she has no real policies that are specific in anything. And he could have definitely. I've read Trump's Agenda 47 website and all of the policy propositions. I've studied them, and I think that they're quite overall good. And he could have brought the conversation to a much higher level of thinking global, thinking systemically, thinking about direct policies. And he did none of that. He just made comments about Marxism. She's a Marxist. It's like, what does that even mean for the people listening to you? It doesn't mean much. It's ephemeral.
I think he was on a sort of a tight. He had to sort of find a middle ground so that he doesn't look like he's attacking an African American woman, and therefore he would be
Yeah.
portrayed as being racist. And
Maybe it was,
so he had to be soft on her, and then he also had to show that he's not this angry man who is backing at a woman and so forth. So I think he was treading on a very
yeah.
tight ground. So,
Mm,
because there was so much he could have talked about and raised and challenged her. But I think that was where he had to exercise the refrain and not even get angry, because at points she kept on provoking him. How do you say to a former president, you're a disgrace to the world? How do you even, those are not the kind of words you say in a sort of a public and international fora, because the whole world is watching the debate.
yeah, you're right. And it was admitted by Democratic Party handlers afterwards that Kamala was intentionally trying to provoke Trump into anger. And so I think you're right that he was trying really hard to stay away from getting influenced by those emotions. It's true. It, for me, it's just like the U.S. has this small, tiny closing window to avoid the inevitable collapse into what could become easily, in my mind, a calamitous civil war, a complete breakdown of the banking system where people will go crazy on both sides. And whether it's the extreme left or the extreme right, there's been a radicalization that has been activated by intelligence agencies over many generations to work extremists on both elements. The same way that we saw in the buildup to the Civil War in America in the 1850s. Before the Civil War began, there was already, for the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, an effort to create terrorist outfits in the North around some of the more radical abolitionists, around William Lloyd Garrison, who was himself tied to the Cabots, who spawned certain things like the Brown shooting at Harper's Ferry, which killed a bunch of people. And that was a provocation in 1858 to the Confederate power to only see that the North, the abolitionists, were ready to kill you all, to carry out terrorism, and then that put fuel on the fire inversely of the Confederate slave power factions, who would then go and carry out terrorism into the North. And the majority of the people living in the North and the South were sort of washed out, and the fires of war were built up accordingly. And I think I could kind of see something similar including the economic disarray of the banking system, which again was about to collapse before Lincoln had gotten in. And that's all being replicated again with, again, something similar too, where even the Republican Party under Trump, there's a big fight whether you have the transhumanist imperial faction around Peter Thiel and Palantir, which is closely aligned to the US military industrial complex that wishes to come out dominant under a new presidential administration of Trump. Elon Musk, I believe, is also a part of that same US military industrial complex. He's a transhumanist, just like Thiel is. They both work together to create PayPal. Like they're both part of the same operation going back a couple of decades into the 90s and of Silicon Valley, technocrats. And they have an idea of creating sort of this libertarian empire that revives the ambition of people like Albert Pike, who was a KKK founder and a leading general of the Confederacy, who was a leading member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. If you look at the Knights of the Golden Circle, these were the proto KKK terrorists sponsored by the city of London in America that had 100,000 men in the 1850s, and their ambition was to create an expansive slave power broken free of the Constitution, with its own pro-British special relationship, and a command center, a capital in Cuba. And the founders of the United Fruit Company were all part of this operation. They were also embedded within the mafia that's very much tied to occult, Knights of Malta operations within the Vatican that were working with these agencies to create an empire. And people can just Google, if people are listening and they're confused by what I'm saying, Google Knights of the Golden Circle, and you'll see exactly what their idea of an empire, an island empire modeled on the island empire of Great Britain, or this is what also Japan was induced to model itself onto, as an island empire, which would control most of Asia for Japan. Britain would control, a big jurisdiction of Europe. And the KKK Knights of the Golden Circle would control most of South America, Central America, Mexico, and they would ultimately grow, with a very evil, vicious idea of manifest destiny to take over and expand the slave system into the North. So that's what I believe that you have being revived right now with Elon Musk's efforts to overthrow governments like Maduro in Venezuela, or you see this with the libertarian, the Palantir Peter Thiel network of privately run city states in Honduras, where they want to build them in Argentina under Milei, who's privatized everything in Argentina. And he pulled, Argentina away from the BRICS. Argentina was supposed to join the BRICS, and Milei, who's a libertarian puppet, privatized everything, kept the Argentinian economy tied to the US dollar. And it's this libertarian thing where people are suffering en masse. There's massive protests that are not being shown by the media, but he's a darling of Elon Musk, of Peter Thiel. You see it also with the Bitcoin cities of El Salvador, or in Brazil. They're trying to also run a coup to bring in. I'm not a big fan of Lula, frankly. I think he's failed morally in a lot of the things he could have been doing. But I mean, at the same time, they're pushing to bring in a hardcore right-wing libertarian government to pull Brazil out of the BRICS and into this Argentina libertarian empire managed by these creatures that want to take control of the new Knights of the Golden Circle. Bolsonaro being possibly a puppet of what they want to bring online there. They want to overthrow the Honduras government. There's a coup underway run by the U.S. to overthrow Xiomara Castro. And she's the one who canceled these charter private cities that Palantir has been behind. She canceled the charter, and they're suing her for I don't know, $18 billion or something. And they're trying to run a coup. They're doing the same thing in Bolivia. Evo Morales spoke against this when he was overthrown in 2019. But that's what they want to do. So it's a concern, and that's one aspect of the battle that I think there's something good being revived in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party of Tulsi Gabbard and Bobby Kennedy that represents something anti-imperial. But then you have this other evil thing as well, which is also there, that too few people, I believe, appreciate what this is, as far as like a Christian fascist reactionary response to the insane woke liberal fascism of the left. It's a controlled opposition that's being groomed, you know?
What would be your concluding remarks? And quickly then is that is the forum, was the forum a prelude for the BRICS meeting? And also because my observation was the Chinese interest in restoring health and establishing health centers locally. And of course, this would be the resurrection of the health centers that had been there before IMF, World Bank structural adjustments that forced on governments to remove the subsidies for social programs and so on. That was one aspect I found very interesting. But anyway, what would be your concluding remarks so that you could, and I really appreciate speaking with you. There's always a lot to learn from.
Well, thank you. And I guess for my concluding remarks, I would say that it is important to not lose sight that we are living through a historic systemic breakdown crisis, which has been built into the system over many generations. It's not a typical day, it's not another day. And so considerations over what the new system will be are at a breaking point. There's such a heated fight over what that will look like that it's difficult for people to imagine, since nobody listening to this show has ever lived through something similar of this scope and scale and magnitude ever in their lives. You have to kind of go to history books and piece together what this sort of thing kind of looks like, involving a study of things like the hyperinflationary meltdown of Germany and Weimar in 1923, or maybe the Great Depression, the controlled blowout of the banking system in 1929, and the associated growth of fascism and eugenics as the economic miracle solutions that were sold to credulous Americans and Canadians and Europeans as the thing that will help them feed their families after years of psychological shock therapy, starvation on the streets of what had formerly been first world countries. So we're in something like that, but even bigger. And so it's so important for people to really look at what are the historic dynamics that Russia, China, the BRICS nations especially have chosen to hold on to as they navigate through the storm and avoid the traps that have been set for them to fall into forever wars. Because the oligarchy, when they're in an economic crisis, what it's always done is you flip over the chessboard by war usually, and then deal with the economic decay and collapse by creating a new economy in the fog of war. And then you can blame the enemy, whoever that enemy is during the war, as being the cause of why the economy collapsed and not the real thing. So that's what they've wanted to do. And that's why they've been trying to provoke a war, especially against Iran, which fortunately Iran and other leaders amongst in Lebanon and have not been stupid enough to fall prey to these traps, these provocations. They've withheld so much. It's crazy how much has been withheld, because it is understood, I believe, that if they do give in to a desire to strike back, an eye for an eye, it will unleash generations to condemnation in forever wars and death and turmoil that will not be easy to heal even a century or 2 centuries into the future. And I think that there's a certain coherence amongst the intelligentsia of China and of Russia and other nations, that it is so important to keep your head on your shoulders, to not give in to provocations, to just wait for the enemy to collapse into their own folly, which is happening as we speak. And then hopefully within the weakness of the oligarchy's collapse, we have an ability for patriots, true patriots, to emerge with a better appreciation for what their history was and can once again become, which I hope I'm living up to a little bit, and other people I know are living up to this, which can begin to see and work with those nations that want to survive as allies in some form of win-win cooperation, especially on the Arctic, which is what Canada can play a very positive role in if we choose to, on co-developing with China and with India, and especially with Russia, our Arctic frontier as a domain for resource development, new cities, which is what Russia is doing with their Far East development strategy that came out of this Eurasian conference that just ended in Vladivostok. So the polar Silk Road is another aspect to that, which can replace the policy of war and seeing the Arctic as a zone for conflict instead of a zone for mutual collaboration. These are all good things. So I'm really keeping my mind and my energy focused on trying to expand those potentials and help educate people about how this has been built into and has shaped the fabric of our history, the fight for the Arctic. Why did Russia sell Alaska to America? Why did Lincoln's allies try to extend the American rail lines through Canada into Alaska and into Russia and China in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s? How was that thwarted by these same oligarchical interests who still exist to this day, using the same techniques that they ever were? And how can this again help us shape a pathway out of our crisis into something that is a good future for everybody? So I would end it with those considerations right there. And I would encourage people who want to know more. I just released a documentary with my wife called The Arctic Platform of Cooperation or War, which is easy to find on my websites, canadianpatriot.org or risingtidefoundation.net. And check out those documentaries. We're putting a lot of work into those. And we want to really try to shape or inspire people to fight to shape policy around that type of strategic thinking.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and we'll check it out. And also now appreciate you making me understand why Putin is looking forward to Kamala's infectious laugh.
Yes.
Thanks again. And
You
one
too.
of these days we'll talk about Canada. Yes.
All right. I look forward to it.
My sincere thanks to each and every one of you who joined us today during our conversation with Matthew Ehret. Matthew Ehret is the director of the Rising Tide Foundation based in Montreal, Canada. He is a geopolitical analyst. Today, Matthew Ehret provided analysis that integrated the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit, the American presidential debate, and 9/11 23rd anniversary, but from a historical and contemporary perspectives. The two-day Forum on Africa-China Cooperation Summit was held in Beijing, China, from September 4th to the 6th. I am Assumpta Uturu, Spotlight Africa, KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles, and streaming live on kpfk.org. So until next time, peace and love.